The North Sea, today a cold and gray expanse of churning water and busy shipping lanes, holds a secret. Beneath its waves, hidden by silt and shadow, lies an entire lost world. This is not a myth, not a legend whispered over maps, but a real place, a forgotten chapter in the story of humanity. Imagine where now there is only the deep. There were once rolling hills, wide rivers winding through lush forests, and valleys where animals grazed. This was a land where people lived, loved, hunted, and died for thousands of years. Then slowly and then suddenly the sea came for it all. The water rose, the storms raged, and the land drowned. Memory of it faded into the vague fear of fishermen who sometimes pulled strange bones from their nets. This is the story of Doggerland, the true Atlantis of the North Sea, a homeland swallowed by the rising tides, waiting to be remembered. The story of Doggerland begins not with a discovery, but with a mystery pulled from the dark water in a trawler's net. For centuries, fishermen working the rough waters of the North Sea, particularly a vast submarine bank called the Dogger Bank, have been hauling up more than just fish. Their nets would sometimes groan with the weight of strange things, enormous, fossilized bones of creatures that no longer walked the earth, antlers the size of small trees, and curiously shaped pieces of flint that looked too regular, too purposeful to be mere stones. The fishermen called these finds fairy stones or devil's fingers, and they would often keep them as curiosities, lucky charms from the deep. The scientific world initially paid little mind to these stories, dismissing them as the fancies of superstitious sailors. The North Sea was just a sea, after all, a barrier between nations, not a library of lost history. But a few curious minds listened. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, naturalists and geologists began to examine these odd relics seriously. The bones were identified. They belonged to mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant elk, and lions, animals of a cold, grassy plain, not a deep ocean. The flints were unmistakably the work of human hands, finely crafted tools, hunting points, and scrapers. A profound question began to form, a puzzle that seemed impossible. How did the bones of land animals and the tools of ancient people end up at the bottom of the sea, dozens of miles from any shore? The only logical answer was as staggering as it was simple. They did not end up there. They were already there. They were lying exactly where they had been left, in a landscape that was now submerged. The North Sea, these pioneers realized, was not always a sea. During the deep freeze of the last great ice age, so much of the planet's water was locked up in colossal ice sheets that the global sea level was over 100 meters lower than it is today. What is now the stormy channel between Britain and Europe was not water at all, but a wide, low plain, a land bridge, a continent in its own right. This was Doggerland. Picture it not as a barren, frozen wasteland, but as a vast, dynamic frontier. At the peak of the ice, the northern parts were pressed under glaciers miles thick, but further south, closer to what would become the English Channel, it was a cold but habitable expanse. It was a mammoth steppe, a sweeping, grassy plain dotted with shrubs, cut through by mighty, silt-laden rivers flowing from the melting ice edges. These rivers carved valleys and deposited rich soil. In the cold, dry air, herds of megafauna thrived. Mammoths were the giants, moving in family groups, their great tusks sweeping the ground. Reindeer migrated in their thousands, followed by stealthy predators like the scimitar-toothed cat and packs of wolves. And where the game went, people followed. These were not modern humans as we know them, but their direct ancestors, the incredibly resourceful Homo sapiens who had moved into Europe. They were the Mesolithic people, the Middle Stone Age, hunters and gatherers, masters of their environment. They walked across this land from the continent into Britain not by boat, but simply by putting one foot in front of the other. They camped by the rivers, hunted in the grasslands, and left their finely made flint tools on the ground where they worked. This was their home, a continent teeming with life, now silent under 100 meters of cold, salt water. The evidence was no longer just in fishermen's tales. It was a scientific fact. An entire world had been erased from the map and from human memory, and its ghost was beginning to stir from the muddy seabed. To understand the life of Doggerland, we must first witness its dramatic birth from the ice. The world was emerging from a deep freeze, a process not of years, but of millennia. As the global climate began to warm, the great ice sheets, which had once covered much of northern Europe and Britain like a crushing white shell, started to melt. This was not a gentle thaw, but a slow, relentless retreat. Imagine the edge of the ice as a crumbling, dirty cliff of blue-white, dripping and calving, releasing torrents of meltwater. This water had to go somewhere. It gathered into vast, frigid lakes held back only by walls of ice and rubble. And when those walls broke, catastrophic floods scoured the land, carving deep channels that would become future rivers. The land itself, freed from the immense weight of the ice, which was miles thick in places, began to stir. It literally started to rise, a process called isostatic rebound, like a cushion slowly puffing back up after a heavy weight is lifted. This was a land in geological motion, groaning and shifting as it awakened. And as the ice retreated northwards, it unveiled a new continent. This newborn Doggerland was a raw, wet, and often harsh place at first. The ground left behind by the glaciers was a chaotic jumble of rocks, gravel, and fine silt known as till. It was a barren, lunar landscape, but life is tenacious. Lichens and hardy mosses were the first pioneers, clinging to the rocks, starting the slow work of breaking stone into soil. Wind-carried seeds followed, then low grasses and shrubs. With plants came insects, and with insects came birds. The very rivers of meltwater that shaped the land began to nurture it, depositing rich sediments along their banks. Slowly, over centuries that blurred into millennia, the gray wasteland transformed. A mosaic of environments began to emerge. In the wetter lowlands, peat bogs formed, spongy and acidic, preserving anything that fell into them with remarkable care. On higher, drier ground, open grasslands stretched, perfect for grazing herds. In sheltered valleys and along river corridors, scrub gave way to real forests. First came birch and pine, trees that could handle poor soil and cold snaps, their wind-rustled leaves providing the first real canopy. Later, as the climate softened further, dense forests of oak, elm, and hazel would spread, creating a deep, dappled green world. This evolving landscape became a magnet for life. Animals from the southern refuges, where they had survived the Ice Age, began to migrate north into this freshly opened territory. Giant elk with antlers spanning 3 meters stepped cautiously through the wetlands. Aurochs, the enormous wild ancestors of cattle, their horns like polished daggers, browsed in the clearings. Red and roe deer moved through the forest edges. And of course, the mammoth still roamed, though their preferred open steppe was slowly shrinking as the forests advanced. This was the world that the Mesolithic people entered. They were not colonists coming to an empty land. They were pioneers moving with the seasons, following the game and the ripening plants. They were part of the ecosystem, the most adaptable predators within it. They saw Doggerland not as a single country, but as a vast, rich territory of endless possibility. They knew its every hill, its every river bend, its sacred springs and treacherous bogs. Their world was one of sound. The buzz of insects in the marsh, the thunder of hooves on the plain, the whisper of wind through pine needles, and the constant, comforting chatter of flowing water. It was a continent alive, vibrant, and theirs. But this golden age of hunting and gathering, this deep connection to a pristine world, was living on borrowed time. The very process that had created Doggerland, the melting of the ice, was also sowing the seeds of its destruction. The unlocked water from the glaciers was filling the world's oceans, and the sea, patient and hungry, began its long, slow march back towards the land. Who were the people who called Doggerland home? They leave no stone circles, no grand tombs, no painted caves for us to easily find. Their legacy is subtler, written in scattered flint and sunken peat. They were the Mesolithic people, a name that means Middle Stone Age, and they were the ultimate survivors, masters of a world that demanded constant, clever adaptation. They did not build cities or farm fields. They lived with the land, moving through it like the animals they hunted, their lives dictated by the turning seasons, the migration of herds, and the cycles of plants. To imagine them, we must forget modern notions of permanence. Their homes were not castles, but temporary shelters, wooden frames covered with animal hides or bark, easily built and just as easily abandoned as the group moved on. A community might be just a few extended families, 20 or 30 people bound by kinship and shared knowledge, their territory a familiar circuit through the changing landscapes of Doggerland. Their intelligence was their greatest tool. They possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of their environment that would stagger us today. They could read the weather in the shape of a cloud, track an animal by the faintest bend of a blade of grass, and know which root was nutritious and which was poison. Their physical tools, though made of stone, bone, and wood, were works of refined, ingenious craft. The flint tools pulled from the North Sea bed are not crude rocks. They are microliths, tiny, razor-sharp blades of flint, often geometrically shaped like triangles or trapezoids. These were not used alone, but were set into slots in wooden handles or shafts, glued with sticky birch tar to create composite weapons, arrows for hunting deer, barbs for fishing spears, cutting edges for knives. This was advanced, modular technology. They wove nets from plant fibers to catch fish and birds. They carved antler into harpoons to hunt sea mammals in the encroaching estuaries. They likely built simple, sturdy boats from hollowed logs or stretched hides, navigating the rivers and wetlands that crisscrossed their world. Their spiritual world was just as rich and woven into the fabric of daily life. While we have no temples, we can guess at their beliefs from what they left behind and from later, similar cultures. The animals they hunted were not just food. They were respected spirits. A successful hunt required gratitude, and rituals likely accompanied the taking of a great beast like an aurochs or a mammoth. ensuring its spirit would return and allow future generations to be hunted. Places of natural power, a striking hill, a bubbling spring, a strangely twisted ancient tree, would have been sites of reverence. They buried their dead, sometimes with grave goods like tools or ornaments of pierced shell and animal teeth, suggesting a belief in an afterlife, a journey to be prepared for. Music filled their camps as well. Simple flutes carved from bird bone have been found from this period elsewhere in Europe, their notes perhaps accompanying stories told around the fire. These stories were their true library, containing generations of wisdom, the history of the family, the paths of migration, the names of the stars, and the tales of how the world began. Around those flickering fires in the heart of the Doggerland night, with the sounds of the forest around them, the people forged a deep, intimate connection to a land that was, unknown to them, already dying beneath their feet. They were not a lost civilization in the grand sense. They were a successful, vibrant culture living at the peak of a hunter-gatherer existence. Their tragedy is that their entire world, the stage upon which their ancient drama unfolded, would vanish, leaving them as ghosts in our history, their voices silenced by the relentless sea. The change was so slow that no single generation would have truly noticed it. It was the work of centuries, a creeping transformation felt in whispered worries and old stories. The great melt from the northern ice sheets continued, an unstoppable unlocking of frozen water. With each passing year, the global sea level rose, not in dramatic leaps, but in a steady, relentless creep. The ocean began to reclaim its own. For the people of Doggerland, the first signs were subtle, almost deceptive. Perhaps an old, familiar campsite on a riverbank began to flood more frequently during the spring rains. A freshwater spring near a coast might start to taste faintly of salt. The brackish, nutrient-rich water of the advancing estuaries might have initially brought a bounty of shellfish and new types of fish, a welcome change. The elders might have spoken of a time when a certain hill was farther from the sea. Their tales met with polite disbelief by the younger ones who had always known it that way. But the land itself was also changing shape. The immense weight of the ice had been lifted from Scotland and Scandinavia, and like a ship rising after a heavy cargo is removed, these northern lands were rebounding upward. This had a cruel seesaw effect on Doggerland. While the north rose, the softer southern basin of the North Sea, the very heart of the Mesolithic world, began to tilt and sink under the increased pressure of the neighboring uplift. This process, called glacial isostatic adjustment, meant Doggerland was being pushed down as the water was pushing up. It was a double drowning. The sea didn't just rise, the land itself was subtly surrendering, subsiding into the mantle. The real transformation began at the coasts. Low-lying plains, once rich with grazing herds, became salt marshes. The sea invaded through river valleys, turning them into long, probing fingers of salt water, the beginnings of estuaries and inlets. Forests that had stood for centuries faced a new enemy. Salt water seeped into their roots. Great stands of oak and alder, their leaves still green, began to sicken and die, their trunks becoming skeletal sentinels in the advancing shallows. Then over decades they would topple, their fallen logs preserved in the anaerobic embrace of the peat and silt that followed the sea. These drowned forests, sometimes called submarine woodlands, are one of the most haunting pieces of evidence for Doggerland's existence. Even today, fishermen's nets snag on these ancient, waterlogged stumps, and at extremely low tides on some beaches, the remains of these gray, barnacled trees can sometimes be seen, like bones protruding from a grave. For the people, the map of their world was slowly being redrawn, and not for the better. Their vast, contiguous continent was being eaten away at the edges. The once great rivers, now meeting the rising sea, slowed and spilled their silt, creating new mudflats and barriers. Travel routes that had been overland for generations now required boats. Hunting territories were cut off by new channels of water. Freshwater sources became contaminated. The psychological impact must have been profound. The world, which had always been stable in its cycles of season and migration, was becoming unstable. The very earth was becoming fluid, untrustworthy. Sacred sites where ceremonies had been held for generations might vanish beneath the murky water. The stories around the fire would have changed, filled with new anxieties. They were not yet a desperate people. They were adaptable, and they shifted their lifestyles, exploiting the new coastal resources, learning to navigate more open water. But a relentless, invisible pressure was building. The safe, known center of their world was shrinking, and the periphery was becoming a threatening, hungry frontier. The slow drowning had begun, and its pace was about to quicken with terrifying speed. For generations, the people of Doggerland had adapted to the slow creep of the sea. They moved their camps inland, followed the retreating game, and learned to harvest the bounty of the new coasts. The change was a part of life, a challenge met with resilience. Then, one day, the world ended in a way they could never have imagined. Far to the north, off the coast of Norway, a catastrophe was brewing in the silent darkness of the continental shelf. Here, vast, unstable deposits of sediment, Ice Age debris that had piled up for millennia on the edge of the underwater slope, clung to a precarious balance. Something triggered it, an earthquake, a methane gas release from the decomposing organic material within the mud, or simply the overwhelming weight of time. The cause is lost, but the effect is etched into the seabed. An area of seabed the size of Scotland suddenly broke free. This was the Storegga Slide, one of the largest underwater landslides ever known on Earth. The collapse was instantaneous and apocalyptic. Hundreds of cubic miles of rock, sand, and mud plunged into the deep abyssal plain of the Norwegian Sea. The displacement of such a colossal volume of water did not just make a wave. It generated a tsunami of almost incomprehensible scale. A wall of water, hundreds of feet high at its origin, radiated out across the North Atlantic. By the time it reached the shores of Scotland and Iceland, it was still a devastating force, scouring coastlines. But its deadliest path was south, into the shallow bowl of the North Sea, straight into the heart of what remained of Doggerland. Here, the underwater topography acted as a funnel, compressing and focusing the tsunami's energy. The wave would not have appeared as a clean, breaking wall from the deep ocean. In the relatively shallow, complex channels and plains of Doggerland, it would have become a monstrous, churning surge, a sudden, rapid, and terrifying rise in sea level, a rush of dark, debris-choked water moving inland with the speed of a galloping horse. For the Mesolithic communities living along the coasts and in the low-lying river valleys, there would have been little warning. Perhaps a distant rumble, a strange sucking sound as the sea first receded far beyond the lowest tide, stranding fish on suddenly exposed mudflats. Then the horizon would have darkened. The surge would have swept across the remaining plains, up the river valleys, crashing through the dying coastal forests. It would have demolished shelters, drowned families, and obliterated hunting grounds in minutes. The water would have carried with it a soup of mud, shattered trees, and the bodies of animals. As it receded, it scoured the landscape, stripping away the thin soil and leaving behind a wasteland of sand, gravel, and tangled debris. The salt water would have poisoned freshwater springs and flooded the peat bogs that preserved so much of life and history. This was not a single wave, but likely a series of surges, a pounding by the sea that lasted for hours. When the water finally settled, the geography of Doggerland was forever altered. Vast areas that had been marginally above the sea were now permanently submerged. What had been a slow, manageable retreat became a rout. The tsunami was a brutal, definitive blow. It shattered the continuity of life. Survivors, if there were any in the most affected regions, would have been traumatized, their world literally washed away. The stories of this event would have entered legend, a tale of the day the sea rose up in anger and swallowed the land, passed down through shattered communities. Archaeologists searching the seabed in the Doggerbank region have found evidence of this violent past. A chaotic layer of sand and shell fragments dumped suddenly among the finer, quieter muds, a signature of a high-energy marine event. They have also found the remains of drowned forests violently smashed, trees ripped and piled in unnatural directions. The Storegga slide was a geological heartbeat, a single catastrophic pulse that accelerated the end of a world. After this, Doggerland was not just drowning. It was mortally wounded, its final remnants clinging on in a losing battle against an ocean now grown violent. In the wake of the Storegga tsunami, the map of the North Sea was redrawn with brutal finality. Where there had been a wide continental plain connecting Britain to Europe, now there was mostly open, shallow sea. But the drowning was not yet complete. The highest parts of that lost world, the most stubborn hills and plateaus, still held out above the waves. The largest of these was the Dogger Bank, a vast submarine plateau that had once been a range of hills and a watershed within Doggerland. Now, isolated by the rising waters, it became Dogger Island, the last significant remnant of a drowned continent. This was no longer the vast, resource-rich homeland of old. It was a diminished refuge, a final sanctuary for life, both human and animal, holding on against the encircling sea. This island would have been a strange and changing place. Its climate was now fully maritime, buffeted by North Sea winds, fogs rolling in to cloak its contours. It was likely a landscape of contrasts. On its higher, drier core, wind-swept grasslands and heath might have persisted, while the lower, sinking peripheries became salt marshes and lagoons. Fresh water would have been a precious commodity, gathered from rain-fed pools and perhaps a few resilient springs. The great forests were almost certainly gone, claimed by the salt or felled by human hands for fuel and shelter. What trees remained would have been stunted and twisted by the constant wind. The animal life changed too. The giant megafauna like mammoths were likely memories. Their ecological niche vanished with the open plains. Smaller, more adaptable creatures remained. Red deer, wild boar, perhaps smaller herds of reindeer. The waters around the island, however, teemed with life. Seabird colonies would have found new roosts on its cliffs, their cacophony a constant sound. Seals and dolphins populated the coasts, and the nutrient-rich waters made fishing incredibly productive. For the human communities who clung to this last piece of their ancestral world, life became intensely focused on the sea. They were no longer just inland hunters who occasionally fished. They were becoming a coastal people, perhaps even maritime explorers by necessity. Their technology would have shifted. Boats became not just useful but essential for travel, for communication with other scattered groups, and for survival. These were likely dugout canoes or skin-covered curags, capable of navigating the rough, chilly waters between Dogger Island and the now separate coasts of Britain and mainland Europe. Their dwellings, built on the highest ground, would have been sturdy against the gales, perhaps half buried in the earth for warmth and stability. The social world would have contracted and intensified. With less land, populations were concentrated. The old, wide-ranging nomadic circuits were impossible. This might have led to tighter-knit, more territorial communities, but also to increased contact and trade across the water, forging new networks where land-based ones had been severed. Life on Dogger Island was a precarious equilibrium, a constant adaptation to a shrinking reality. The people there were the descendants of the great Mesolithic pioneers, now become experts in a very different, more confined world. They lived with the knowledge that the sea was the source of their food and their greatest threat. Every storm surge would have eaten a little more of the shore. Every generation would have known a smaller island than the one their grandparents described in stories. They were living on borrowed time, on a land that was not just flooding, but sinking. The slow, global sea level rise continued its work, and the tilting of the basin persisted. The high grounds of the Dogger Bank were becoming lower with each passing year. The salt marshes widened, the freshwater pools grew brackish, the storms bit deeper inland. Dogger Island was not a stable new home. It was the final act in a long tragedy, a stage that was itself slowly sinking beneath the curtains of the sea. The people there were the last custodians of a lost world, their everyday an act of resilience against an inevitable tide. The communities on Dogger Island lived in a world of profound duality. They were surrounded by the immense gray expanse of the North Sea, a constant presence that dictated their survival and whispered of their eventual demise. Yet their lives were intensely local, focused on the shrinking contours of their island home. Each day began with an assessment of the sea's mood. Was it a day for launching boats into the rich fishing grounds, or a day to hunker down, mending nets and tools in the shelter of their dwellings? The air would have carried the tang of salt and the rich smell of exposed mud from the vast tidal flats that now likely ringed the island. These flats were both a larder and a trap, offering shellfish, worms, and stranded fish at low tide, but ready to swallow the unwary in silty mud when the water rushed back in. Hunting on the island itself would have been a different pursuit than in the old Doggerland forests. With limited space, game would not have been abundant. A successful hunt for a deer or a boar would have been a major event, coordinated with care to drive the animal into a favorable position, perhaps even towards cliffs or boggy ground. Every part of the animal would have been used: meat, sinew, bone, and hide. But more often, the focus was on the wealth of the sea and shore. They would have crafted sophisticated fish traps from woven willow, set in the tidal channels to harvest mullet, sea bass, and eels as the tide receded. They harpooned seals from their boats, a dangerous and skilled endeavor that provided not only meat but also precious blubber for oil and tough hides for clothing and shelter. The skies, too, offered bounty. They would have collected eggs from cliff-side bird colonies and perhaps used nets to catch ducks and geese during migration. Their social and spiritual life would have been deeply intertwined with this precarious existence. The old stories of the great inland forests, the mammoth hunts, and the wide rivers would have been told and retold, becoming legends of a golden, half-mythical past. New stories were born from the sea, tales of monster waves, of generous spirits of the seal people, of capricious gods of the weather who must be appeased. The very geography of their shrinking island would have been sacred. A particular freshwater spring, increasingly rare and vital, would be a hallowed site. A prominent hill, the highest point which would be the last to drown, might have been a place for rituals, for scanning the horizon for threats or for other communities. Burial practices might have changed, too. With less stable ground, they may have begun to commit their dead to the sea or to raised platforms, a physical reflection of their separation from the deep ancestral earth that was now lost beneath the waves. Trade and contact with the outside world would have been a lifeline, both practical and cultural. While Dogger Island was isolated, it was not utterly alone. The rising seas had also created new coastlines on Britain and mainland Europe. The people of Dogger Island, skilled boaters out of necessity, would have maintained connections. In their vessels, they might have transported prized commodities. Finely worked flint from the island's deposits, amber washed up on its shores, or distinctive tools. In return, they would have received news, marriage partners, and goods like different types of stone or ornamental shells. These journeys across open water were dangerous, but they were essential. They proved that the people of Dogger were not a doomed, isolated tribe, but part of a wider, adapting Mesolithic world. They were fighting for their place in a changing network, even as their own piece of the puzzle was dissolving. Yet with every passing season, those sea voyages became a little longer, as the island shrank and the shores of the continents retreated further away. The very water that connected them to others was also the force that was severing their last ties to the land. Time, measured in generations on Dogger Island, became a countdown written in the encroaching shoreline. The elders, their faces lined by the salt wind, could point to places where they had played as children that were now permanently underwater. A fishing rock, now a submerged hazard. A grassy slope where they gathered berries, now a muddy bank scoured by tides. The stories of the Great Wave, passed down from ancestors who might have been survivors of the Storega tsunami, took on a new, urgent meaning. It was no longer just a tale of ancient disaster. It was a warning of what the sea could do, a reminder of its power. The people lived with a deep cultural memory of loss, a trauma etched into their collective identity. They were the children of the drowned world, and their home was following the same path. Life became an exercise in managed retreat. Camps were moved, not with the old seasonal rhythm-following game, but with a grim, permanent step backward, away from the advancing marshes. Archaeological evidence from similar drowning coastlines elsewhere shows this pattern. a sequence of hearths and tool-making spots, each one a little further inland than the last until there are no more. On Dogger Island, the choices for that final retreat were running out. Conflict between different family groups over the best remaining land, the highest ground, the most reliable freshwater source, might have flared. Cooperation would have been vital for survival, but stress and scarcity can fray the strongest bonds. They may have developed strict rules, sacred laws about who could hunt where and when, to prevent the overexploitation of their dwindling terrestrial resources. Their technology would have reflected this end-stage existence. Finding large pieces of flint for traditional tool-making might have become difficult as the old inland sources were submerged. They likely became masters of recycling, carefully resharpening and reworking old tools, or switching to bone and antler for more items. Their boats, however, would have become more sophisticated than ever. These were no longer just river craft or coastal skiffs. They were potentially capable of longer voyages across open water, the prototypes for the seafaring vessels that would come later in the Neolithic. The very survival of a community might one day depend on the ability of these boats to carry them all with their possessions and tools to a new shore. The knowledge of the wider world, of the wooded coasts of Britain or the mainland, would have been crucial. Scouts might have been sent on reconnaissance, returning with reports of landing sites, water sources, and the dispositions of other human groups already living there. Then, one year, the balance tipped. It might have been a particularly violent winter storm, one that breached a final protective dune ridge or silted up the last reliable freshwater lagoon with salt. It might have been a gradual realization that the shellfish beds were moving further out to sea, reachable only by longer, more dangerous boat trips, and that the deer were simply gone, having swum away or been hunted to local extinction. The end likely came not with a single cataclysmic event, but with a final, unbearable squeeze. The island became unsustainable. The social fabric stretched by hardship might have finally torn. The decision would have been heartbreaking to abandon the home of their ancestors, the land that held their history and their dead, for an uncertain future across the water. We can imagine the final departure. The boats, loaded down with people, dogs, tools, and sacred objects, being pushed off from a beach that was itself disappearing. The last look back at the empty shelters on the ridge, soon to be claimed by the waves. The journey across the cold, gray sea towards the smoke of fires on a distant shore, a shore already inhabited by others who spoke similar but different languages, who had their own territories and histories. The people of Dogger Island did not vanish, they migrated. They were absorbed into the populations of coastal Britain, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany. Their stories of the drowned land became myths, diluted over generations into tales of sunken cities and lost kingdoms beneath the sea. Their unique identity, forged in the isolation of a shrinking refuge, slowly blended away. The last hearth fire on Dogger Island went cold. The wind swept over empty ground. And then one season, the highest hill was just a shallow bank beneath the waves, and the North Sea at last was complete. With the final abandonment of Dogger Island, the North Sea achieved its modern form, a continuous expanse of water separating the British Isles from the European continent. The land that had been Doggerland completed its long submersion, slipping beneath the waves not with a dramatic crash, but with a final, silent sigh. The hills became submerged banks, the river valleys became winding channels on the seafloor, and the forests became beds of waterlogged peat and fallen timber, slowly buried under layers of silt and sand. For thousands of years, Doggerland entered a profound sleep, erased from human memory. Its story was not recorded in any chronicle. It was written only in mud and on a seabed where no human walked. Above the waves, history marched on. The Mesolithic gave way to the Neolithic, where people built monuments like Stonehenge, farmed the land, and domesticated animals. Empires rose and fell, the Romans, the Vikings, the medieval kingdoms of Europe. All of them looked upon the North Sea as just that, a sea. A barrier, a highway for invaders and traders, a source of fish and danger. They had no conception that the rough waters they sailed over had once been a fertile valley, or that the treacherous sandbanks that threatened their ships were the drowned hills of an ancient world. The memory of Doggerland survived only in the faintest of echoes. Perhaps the myth of a sunken land, like Lyoness off Cornwall or the Breton tale of Wise, holds a distant, distorted reflection of this collective trauma. Fishermen's tales of pulling up strange bones and tools persisted, but they were considered curiosities, not clues. The seafloor itself became a dynamic graveyard. Sediments settled, layer upon layer, burying the ancient landscape. Marine life adapted to the new underwater topography. The Dogger Bank, once an island, became a famous fishing ground, its relatively shallow waters teeming with cod and herring, attracted to the complex ecology that now thrived atop the drowned hills. Storms would occasionally stir the seabed, uncovering and then reburying fragments of the past. A mammoth tusk might be dislodged, only to be buried again a century later. A finely worked flint point could lie untouched for millennia beside the skeleton of an aurochs, both waiting in the dark, cold stillness. The tides flowed and ebbed, the waves churned, and the lost world rested, its secrets locked away under tons of cold, salt water. It was a complete historical amnesia. The very existence of this ancient homeland, which had supported thousands of people for 5,000 years, was a blank page. The story of humanity in Europe seemed to leap across the English Channel, with no thought of the solid ground that had once made the crossing a simple walk. Doggerland was not just lost, it was forgotten, a missing chapter in the middle of our own story, its pages waterlogged and seemingly unreadable. The continent of Europe had a ghost, a phantom limb, and no one even felt the ache of its absence. The long sleep of Doggerland began to stir in the age of reason and industry. The North Sea, once just an expanse of mystery and hazard, became a zone of human activity. In the 19th century, as trawling technology advanced with the use of steam-powered vessels and stronger, larger nets, fishermen began to dredge up more than just fish from the Dogger Bank and other shallow areas. Their nets now scraped the seabed with a new thoroughness, and they brought up a baffling array of objects. Giant, curved bones too large for any modern creature, weathered antlers of impossible span, and most intriguingly, pieces of dark, glossy flint that were unmistakably shaped by human intelligence. These were not the fairy stones of old superstition. They were evidence. These curiosities found their way into the pockets of sailors and then onto the desks of interested amateurs and early scientists. One of the first to piece together the puzzle was a visionary British geologist named Clement Reid. Working in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Reed studied not only the objects pulled from the sea, but also the geology of the British coast. He noted the presence of peat beds and freshwater plant remains exposed at low tide in places like the coast of East Anglia, far out from the current shoreline. He listened to the fishermen's stories. In his 1913 book, Submerged Forests, he put forward a revolutionary idea. He proposed that the North Sea had been a great habitable plain during a period of lower sea level, connecting Britain to the continent. He argued that the animal bones and human tools were in situ. They were lying right where they had been left when this plain was dry land. Reed was sketching the outline of a lost world, giving it a scientific foundation. He called it the Great Plain, but the name that would stick was already emerging from the fishermen's slang for their fishing ground, Doggerland. Around the same time, another dramatic discovery was made, this time on dry land. In the town of Den Helder in the Netherlands, workers digging a canal in the 1870s uncovered a prehistoric skull buried deep in the sediment. It was a human skull, but of a different time. Then in 1931, a trawler named the Kalinda was working off the Norfolk coast. As the crew hauled in their net, they found a tangled mess of peat clumps. When they broke one open, a barbed object made of antler tumbled onto the deck. It was a beautifully crafted hunting weapon, a harpoon point, later dated to the Mesolithic period. The Kalinda point was a sensational find. It wasn't just a tool. It was a work of art and technology, lost not in a cave or a burial mound, but in the middle of the sea. It proved that people weren't just passing through this submerged landscape. They were living there, hunting there, thriving there. These clues were like the first scattered words of a long-forgotten language. Geologists, archaeologists, and paleontologists began to listen. They started to map the strange findings, noting where the bones and tools were coming from. They began to understand that the North Sea floor was not a random junkyard, but a preserved, if jumbled, archaeological site of continental scale. The two world wars ironically provided more data, as the laying of sea mines, the use of sonar, and the seismic booms of explosions began to reveal the hidden topography of the seabed. Echo sounders showed valleys and ridges that looked nothing like a typical ocean floor, but exactly like a terrestrial landscape. The ghost of Doggerland was beginning to take shape in the scientific imagination, no longer a myth, but a hypothesis written in bone, stone, and peat, waiting for the technology to truly bring it back to light. The mid-20th century saw the ghost of Doggerland shift from a compelling hypothesis to a tangible, mappable reality. This transformation was driven not by a single dramatic discovery, but by the quiet, relentless march of new technology. The oil and gas industry, hungry for resources beneath the North Sea, began to conduct intensive seismic surveys. They sent sound waves pulsing through the water and into the seabed, recording the echoes that bounced back from different layers of rock and sediment. Their goal was to find fossil fuels, but their data revealed something else entirely: a lost geography. The seismic profiles showed clear, unmistakable features buried deep beneath the marine mud. There were the winding, deep-cut channels of ancient river systems, some rivaling the Rhine in scale. There were the gentle slopes of hills and the basins of forgotten lakes, all preserved under layers of accumulated silt. It was as if an X-ray was being taken of the seafloor, revealing the skeleton of a world. Geologists and a new breed of scientists, marine geoarchaeologists, pored over these industrial data sets with growing excitement. They could now begin to draw maps. One of the most influential was Professor Bryony Coles, who in the 1990s gave the lost world its popular name, Doggerland. She published a series of hypothetical maps that captured the public's imagination. These were not just vague outlines. They showed a recognizable landscape with coasts, rivers, and estimated shorelines at different periods of sea level rise. They transformed Doggerland from an abstract idea into a place you could almost visit in your mind's eye. You could trace the path of a great river, later named the Schotten River, after another pioneering geologist, flowing northwards from the Channel Basin. You could imagine the watersheds and the highlands that would have been the most desirable land for human settlement. At the same time, another technological leap was occurring in archaeology on dry land: the development of precise radiocarbon dating. This technique, which measures the decay of radioactive carbon in organic materials, allowed scientists to finally put firm dates on the Doggerland finds. A piece of antler tool, a lump of peat containing seeds, a mammoth bone, all could now be placed on a timeline. This data proved that Doggerland was not just a brief land bridge, but a long-lasting, stable environment. It showed that the landscape had existed for millennia through climatic shifts and ecological changes, and that humans had been present throughout its long history. The harpoon points and flint tools were not from a single era. They told a story of continuous habitation, from the harsh millennia just after the ice retreated to the final, desperate days on the shrinking island. These two strands, the mapping of the physical land and the dating of the life upon it, wove together to create a coherent narrative. Scientists could now say with confidence when the land was exposed, how it looked at different times, and that people were there. They could model the coastlines retreat century by century. They could identify likely hotspots for human activity, the confluence of major rivers, the shores of large lakes, the sheltered edges of hills. Doggerland was no longer a collection of curious artifacts. It was becoming a historical stage, with its own chronology, its own changing scenery, and a cast of human characters whose daily lives were now the subject of serious, urgent inquiry. The lost world was being resurrected not by shovels, but by sound waves and atomic clocks, revealing a deep history hidden in plain sight beneath the busiest sea in the world. The turn of the 21st century marked a new era for Doggerland, moving from mapping and theory into a period of direct, stunning discovery. This was made possible by another leap in technology and a fortuitous, massive engineering project: the construction of artificial islands and the deepening of shipping lanes in the Dutch sector of the North Sea, an area known as Maasvlakte II, part of the port of Rotterdam. To create new land, millions of cubic meters of sand were suction dredged from the bottom of the North Sea, from areas that were once the very heart of prehistoric Doggerland. This sand was not sterile. It was an archaeological slurry packed with the remains of the lost world. As the sand was sprayed onto the new coast, it began to yield an unimaginable treasure trove. Beachcombers and amateur archaeologists, scanning the freshly deposited shores, started finding artifacts by the thousands. This was not like a traditional dig, carefully peeling back layers. It was a vast, scrambled collection, but an incredibly rich one. The finds were breathtaking in their variety and preservation. There were the expected stone tools, exquisite flint blades, thumbnail-sized microliths, and hefty axes. But there were also objects made of organic materials, things that almost never survive on dry land sites. Bone needles, so fine they must have been used for sewing fitted clothing. Sharp fish hooks carved from antler. A wooden digging stick, its tip worn smooth from use. Most haunting of all were the personal items, a beautifully carved bead made of amber which must have traveled from far-off Baltic shores, and simple pendants of pierced animal teeth. These were not just tools, they were belongings, expressions of identity and aesthetic sense. Then came the fauna, a snapshot of an entire ecosystem. Bones and teeth of mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, and giant elk were common. But there were also the remains of smaller creatures, mice, voles, frogs, and birds, which told scientists about the microenvironments, the grasslands, the reed beds, the forests. They found the shells of freshwater mussels and the opercula of snails, indicating clean, flowing water. They even discovered insects, their exoskeletons preserved in the peat. Each of these was a data point, allowing researchers to reconstruct the climate, the vegetation, and the seasonal rhythms of Doggerland with astonishing precision. They could tell what the weather was like in a spring 10,000 years ago by the type of beetle wing case found in a clump of ancient peat. Among the most emotionally powerful finds were the footprints. In 2014, a team studying seismic data identified a series of subtle depressions on a buried layer of the seabed. They were the unmistakable, elongated prints of a herd of aurochs moving together across a mudflat. Nearby, mingled with them, were human footprints. The image this conjured is profound. A small group of Mesolithic hunters tracking the great beasts across the soft ground. The footprints, frozen in time and then buried, are a direct connection to a single moment, a snapshot of life and survival. Even more touching were the isolated human footprints, including those of a child, pressed into the ancient silt. These were not kings or warriors. They were ordinary people, going about their day in a landscape that now lies at the bottom of the sea. The Mesolithic finds transformed Doggerland from an abstract, scientifically modeled world into a tangible, crowded, noisy place. It proved that the land was not just traversed, but deeply lived in, loved, and utilized in every conceivable way. The treasure was not gold, but mud, bone, and flint, the true currency of a lost human story. As the story of Doggerland came into sharper focus, it began to resonate with a chilling and contemporary urgency. The narrative of its drowning is not a simple fable of natural change. It is a detailed case study of climate change and its catastrophic impact on human societies. The engine of Doggerland's destruction was the monumental shift in global climate at the end of the last ice age. The warming that melted the glaciers and made the land initially habitable was the same force that ultimately consumed it. This was not a local event, but a global transformation, and the fate of Doggerland was a direct consequence of the rising thermometer of the planet. Scientists studying the layers of sediment, the pollen grains, and the isotopes in shells from the North Sea bed can chart this change with remarkable clarity. They see the transition from cold, dry steppe grasses to warmer birch scrub, and finally to dense, temperate forest. They can track the dramatic pulses of meltwater from collapsing ice sheets that caused rapid, jarring rises in sea level. The Storegga slide itself may have been triggered by this very instability, the warming climate releasing methane from seafloor deposits, destabilizing the slopes. Doggerland's story is one of interconnected systems. The atmosphere warmed, the ice melted, the seas rose, the land sank, and the weather patterns likely became more volatile. The people on the ground were not experiencing climate change as a concept, but as a series of escalating disasters. The salt poisoning of their drinking water, the drowning of their hunting grounds, the increasing fury of storms battering their shrinking shores, and finally, the tsunami that likely felt like the sea itself delivering a final, murderous blow. This ancient drama holds up a stark mirror to our modern predicament. The scale is different. Their change took millennia, ours is taking decades, but the fundamental processes are the same. Rising seas inundating coastal communities, changing weather patterns disrupting food sources, the forced migration of populations as their homes become uninhabitable. The people of Doggerland were climate refugees. When they packed their boats and left Dogger Island for the coasts of Britain and Europe, they were fleeing an environment that could no longer support them, seeking refuge in lands already occupied by others. This migration would have caused tensions, conflicts, but also new exchanges of knowledge and technology. Their integration into new societies is a prehistoric lesson in resilience and adaptation in the face of planetary upheaval. Doggerland thus ceases to be merely a fascinating archaeological mystery. It becomes a warning, etched in layers of submerged peat and silt. It demonstrates with brutal clarity that coastlines are not fixed, that environments are fragile, and that even a successful, adaptable civilization is utterly vulnerable to the relentless physical forces of a changing world. The inhabitants of Doggerland had no responsibility for their changing climate. They were its innocent victims. Our situation is different, but the potential end result, the loss of vast, habitable lands to the sea, echoes with a familiar, dreadful rhythm. Their world drowned. They adapted, moved, and survived, but their homeland was erased forever. As we look at our own rising seas and warming atmosphere, the ghost of Doggerland asks us a silent, urgent question. Which of our own lands will we write into the next chapter of this ancient, repeating story? The final exodus from Doggerland did not mark the end of its influence. The dispersal of its people across the coastlines of northwestern Europe was not a vanishing act, but a seeding. These were not primitive refugees. They were skilled survivors, bearers of deep knowledge about the sea, about resources, and about survival in a changing world. Their arrival onto the shores of Britain, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany would have sent ripples through the existing Mesolithic communities there. They brought with them unique technologies refined in their island refuge, advanced boat designs, sophisticated fishing techniques like deep water angling with hooks, and perhaps new styles of tool making. Their stories, their myths of the drowned land, would have entered the oral traditions of the continent, perhaps evolving over centuries into the Celtic and Norse legends of sunken kingdoms beneath the waves. This integration may have accelerated cultural change. The pressure of new arrivals, combined with the shared trauma of a changing climate that affected everyone, could have spurred innovation and social reorganization. Some archaeologists speculate that the end of Doggerland and the concentration of populations along the new coastlines created a kind of fertile crescent around the southern North Sea basin. With more people in closer proximity, sharing ideas and competing for resources, the conditions might have been set for the next great revolution, the transition from hunting and gathering to farming. The Neolithic way of life, with its domesticated plants and animals, did not emerge in a vacuum. It took root in a social landscape that had already been stirred, connected, and made acutely aware of environmental precariousness by the slow disaster happening just offshore. The people of Doggerland in their dispersal may have helped prepare the ground, literally and culturally, for the new world to come. The land itself, even drowned, continued to shape history. The Dogger Bank, the sunken core of the lost island, remained a dominant feature of the North Sea. Its shallow waters created the richest fishing grounds in northern Europe, sustaining economies and fueling conflicts for centuries. The sandbanks and shifting channels that were once river valleys and hills became navigational hazards, dictating sea routes and the sites of countless shipwrecks. In the 20th century, this same area, so rich in life, was given a grim new name. Broad 14s and Dogger Bank became infamous battlegrounds in the world wars, their waters churned by naval battles and sown with mines. The very sediments that buried Doggerland now hold pipelines and communication cables, the arteries of our modern world. And in a final, ironic twist, the oil and gas deposits that the industry's seismic surveys revealed, deposits formed from the ancient, rich biomass of Doggerland's swamps and forests, have powered the modern economies whose carbon emissions now drive a new era of rising seas. The lost land has, from its grave, profoundly directed the geography, economy, and even the conflicts of the world that replaced it. Its ghost has never stopped shaping our own. Despite the breathtaking advances in our understanding, Doggerland remains a world of profound mystery. The sea, which preserved it in its cold, dark embrace, also guards its deepest secrets jealously. We have maps, but they are outlines. We have artifacts, but they are mostly scattered, moved by currents and dredging. The central, haunting question persists. Where are the people? We have their tools, their footprints, even their DNA in the broader European population, but we have found no conclusive traces of their camps, their hearths, or their burial sites still intact on the seabed. The heart of their society, their places of living, dying, and ceremony, remains elusive. The relentless scour of the sea over millennia has likely destroyed the fragile remains of their wooden shelters and scattered their bones. Or perhaps these sites lie buried under meters of sediment in the deepest, most inaccessible parts of the North Sea basin, waiting for a technology we have yet to invent to find them without disturbing their rest. Other mysteries swirl like the North Sea fog. What was the true scale and impact of the Storegga tsunami? Did it deliver a single, killing blow to the remaining communities? Or was it a catastrophic event from which some resilient pockets recovered? The sand layer found across the seabed suggests a massive surge, but the human story of that day is written in water and lost time. Were there spiritual or ceremonial centers on Doggerland, places of gathering that held significance for people across the wide plain? Did they build anything more permanent than temporary camps? The lack of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is a challenge. Furthermore, what was the nature of their contact with other regions? The amber bead found in the Dutch sand shows long-distance connections, but were these trade networks? Or did people carry precious items with them over generations as they migrated? The genetic story is still being unraveled, promising to tell us more about who they were and where they went, but it is a complex puzzle where pieces are missing. The environment itself holds unanswered questions. What did the interior, far from the coasts, truly look like at its peak? Was it a uniform plain, or a patchwork of microclimates and ecosystems? The precise timing of the final submergence of Dogger Island is still debated. The last holdout may have vanished sooner or later than our models suggest. Every new discovery from dredging or scientific coring adds data, but also deepens the mystery. Each flint tool is an answer, but also a new question. Who held it? What were they making, or hunting, or defending against in that very moment? The silence of the submerged landscape is not empty. It is thick with these unasked and unanswered questions. Doggerland is a reminder that the past is not a puzzle to be solved, but a conversation to be joined, with the sea itself as a stubborn, silent interlocutor. We have learned enough to know how much we have lost, and that perhaps is the greatest mystery of all, the sheer echoing scale of a forgotten world and the quiet hum of its vanished lives, still felt in the pull of the tide and the strange treasures in a fisherman's net. The story of Doggerland is far from over. It is not a closed book resting on the seabed, but an ongoing investigation, one that is entering its most exciting and technically sophisticated phase. The future of understanding this lost world lies in a combination of brute force engineering and delicate, futuristic science. The driving forces are still the North Sea's industries, but now with a conscious eye for preservation. As new wind farms, cables, and pipelines are planned, archaeological assessment is becoming a standard part of the process. This isn't just about salvage, it's about proactive exploration. Before a single turbine foundation is driven into the seafloor, detailed surveys using multi-beam sonar and magnetometers scan the area, creating ultra-high-resolution 3D maps of the submerged landscape. These digital terrains can reveal features invisible to older technologies. The subtle outline of a former lagoon, the precise cut of a river channel, or even anomalies that could be archaeological sites. The next step is direct investigation, but here lies the greatest challenge and the most thrilling potential. The North Sea is a hostile environment, dark, cold, with powerful currents and near-zero visibility. Traditional diving is dangerous and limited. The answer is emerging in the form of robotic archaeology. Remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, equipped with high-definition cameras, robotic arms, and suction samplers, can now be deployed from surface vessels. Guided by the detailed maps, these robotic proxies can hover over a promising site, gently clear away sediment with water jets, and retrieve artifacts with surgical precision, all while streaming live video to archaeologists in a warm, dry shipboard laboratory. They can take core samples of the layered seabed, extracting cylinders of sediment that hold millennia of environmental data like a climate archive. There is even talk of developing robotic underwater digs, where a fleet of smaller, intelligent machines could methodically excavate a sealed site on the seafloor, something never before attempted in such deep, turbulent waters. The most revolutionary possibilities, however, lie in the realm of virtual Doggerland. The vast amounts of data from seismic surveys, sonar maps, core samples, and artifact locations are being fed into powerful computers. Scientists are beginning to construct not just static maps, but dynamic, living simulations of the lost world. These digital models can show how the coastline changed year by year over centuries. They can simulate the ecosystem, showing herds of aurochs migrating across the plain, driven by seasonal changes in vegetation that are modeled from fossil pollen data. They can even begin to model human movement, suggesting the most likely pathways people would have taken between resources. The goal is to create an immersive, scientifically accurate simulation, a virtual time machine that would allow researchers to walk through the drowned landscapes, testing hypotheses about where people might have lived and how they interacted with their environment. This digital resurrection, built on petabytes of hard data, promises to bring Doggerland back to life in a way that no museum exhibit ever could. The future of this past is digital, robotic, and breathtakingly detailed, promising to drag this sunken world, piece by virtual piece, back into the light of human understanding. As the research continues, a more nuanced and profound picture of Doggerland is emerging, one that transcends a simple narrative of loss. It is becoming clear that this was not a uniform, empty plain, but a deeply regional and diverse continent. The environment a family group experienced in the hills of the north, near the lingering ice, would have been starkly different from the life of a community in the forested river valleys of the south, or on the marshy coasts of the east. Each area had its own rhythm, its own resources, and its own challenges. The people adapted not to a single Doggerland, but to a mosaic of micro-worlds within it. Their languages, their tool styles, their stories likely varied from region to region, creating a tapestry of cultures as rich and complex as the landscape itself. This diversity, born of a vast territory, makes the loss all the more profound. We are not mourning one culture, but many, a whole spectrum of human experience adapted to a forgotten geography. The emotional resonance of Doggerland lies in this intimate, ordinary humanity. These were not mythic heroes of a sunken Atlantis, but people whose concerns were immediate and familiar. A parent teaching a child to nap flint by a riverbank. The anxiety of tracking a wounded boar into dense brush. The weariness and satisfaction at the end of a successful fishing trip. The grief of burying a loved one in the peat, marking the spot with a carved antler. The wonder of a child finding a rare piece of amber on a beach. Their world was one of practical magic, where every animal was a spirit and every spring had a story. They lived with a deep, ingrained knowledge of their place, a knowledge that died with the land. When we hold a Doggerland microlith, we are not just holding a tool. We are holding the crystallized intention of a person who needed to feed their family, who looked out across a landscape we can only simulate, and who felt the same sun, now filtered through millennia, on their skin. This connection bridges an impossible gap, It makes the vast sweep of geological time and climate change achingly personal. The rising sea level is no longer just a line on a graph. It is the slow flooding of that family's favorite campsite, the salting of the spring where they drank, the relentless narrowing of their child's future. Their ultimate migration is not a statistic. It is the heart-wrenching decision to pack what they could carry, push their boat into an uncertain gray horizon, and look back one last time at the hill that held their ancestors. In their story, we see our own potential futures reflected in the dark water. Doggerland compels us because it is a ghost of our own making, a warning from our shared past. It whispers that civilizations are not lost in grand, fiery cataclysms alone, but often in the slow, quiet creep of water, in the accumulated pressure of a changing sky. And in that whisper, we hear the echo of our own time, and we are forced to wonder what from our world will one day be someone else's haunting mystery, lying silent and waiting beneath an indifferent sea. Long before scientists gave it the name Doggerland, the ghost of this lost world lingered in the collective memory of the people who lived around the North Sea. It survived not in history books, but in the weathered faces of fishermen, in the names they gave to treacherous shoals, and in the stories told in harborside taverns after the nets were mended. For generations, those who worked the sea knew there was something strange about the Dogger Bank and other shallow grounds. The heavy, tusk-like bones that ripped their nets were called giant's fingers or mermaid's ivory. The finely worked flints were thunderbolts, said to be hurled to earth during storms. These objects were tangible proof of a world turned upside down, where things of the land came from the deep. They were omens, curiosities, and sometimes sacred objects kept on a mantle for luck. This folk knowledge created a layer of myth that draped the physical landscape. The tales of sunken lands, bells tolling mournfully from beneath the waves, and sudden, ghostly forests seen at low tide are common all around the North Sea basin. The Celtic legend of Lyoness, a fertile kingdom lost off the coast of Cornwall, and the Breton story of the city of Wise drowned by a vengeful sea may be distant, fragmented echoes of the true collective trauma of Doggerland's drowning. These stories always carry a moral weight, a warning about human pride or a punishment from the gods. But at their core, they speak of a profound loss, of a time when the land was greater and the sea less hungry. They are the poetic truth that preceded the scientific one. Even the names on nautical charts whisper of the past. The Dogger Bank itself takes its name from an old Dutch word for a fishing boat, a practical label for a practical place. But other features, Silver Pit, Well Hole, Swatchway, often describe underwater topography that makes little sense for a flat seabed but perfect sense for a terrestrial landscape. A pit might have been a deep freshwater pool. A well could mark a spring. A swatchway often indicates a clear channel through difficult ground. These are the ghosts of geography, the last faded names on a map whose original features have vanished. The fishermen who first charted these waters with lead lines and instinct were unknowingly mapping the drowned hills and valleys of Doggerland, translating its ancient geography into the language of maritime hazard and opportunity. This folk legacy is a vital part of the story. It proves that Doggerland was never completely forgotten. It was remembered in the bone-deep knowledge of people whose lives were intertwined with that patch of sea. The scientific revolution did not discover Doggerland so much as it translated these deep-seated intuitions, and Erie finds into a new language of cores, carbon dates, and seismic profiles. The fisherman pulling up a mammoth tooth and the professor analyzing a climate model from a sediment core are part of the same human endeavor, trying to understand the profound mystery of what lies beneath the waves and why we feel its absence like a phantom limb. The song of Doggerland is a chorus, sung in the groaning of trawl wires, the sigh of the tide on a beach, and the quiet hum of supercomputers, all trying to give voice to a world that slipped beneath the silence. The most intimate connection to the people of Doggerland may not lie in the mud of the North Sea, but within us. The revolution in ancient DNA analysis is beginning to trace the invisible threads that link the drowned land to the modern populations of Europe. While no complete human skeleton from Doggerland itself has yet been found, the genetic story is being pieced together from the bones of their contemporaries found in caves and burial sites around the edges of the North Sea basin, in Britain, Denmark, and the Netherlands. These people were their cousins, their trading partners, and ultimately the communities that absorbed the last refugees from the drowning island. The emerging genetic picture shows that the Mesolithic inhabitants of prehistoric Europe were not a single static group. They were diverse, with distinct genetic lineages moving and mixing as the ice retreated. The people who inhabited the Great Plains of Doggerland would have been part of this complex tapestry. When their world flooded, they did not vanish from the earth. They migrated, bringing their unique genetic signatures with them. Scientists are now looking for the faint traces of a Doggerland population signal in the DNA of later Neolithic and Bronze Age people from coastal regions. It is a needle in a haystack, but the possibility is profound. The descendants of those who walked the now submerged river valleys may walk the streets of London, Amsterdam, or Copenhagen today. Their genetic legacy is likely blended, diluted over hundreds of generations, but it is a direct biological link to that lost homeland. This genetic research does more than satisfy curiosity. It changes the narrative from one of extinction to one of diaspora and integration. The story ceases to be a tragic dead end and becomes a chapter in the long story of European peopling. The skills the Doggerlanders brought, their maritime expertise, their adapted technologies, would have been valuable assets to the communities they joined. Their arrival may have introduced new ideas and accelerated cultural change along the coastlines. Their DNA, mixed with that of other groups, contributed to the rich genetic diversity of the region. In this light, the drowning of Doggerland was not a wipeout, but a forced scattering, a seeding of its human heritage across a wider area. Furthermore, environmental DNA, eDNA, pulled from the North Sea sediments offers another breathtaking avenue. Scientists can now extract and sequence the minute traces of genetic material shed by ancient plants and animals, and potentially humans, that have been preserved in the layered mud. This could, one day, provide a direct biological snapshot of Doggerland's ecosystem from the soil itself, and might even yield a fleeting trace of its human inhabitants. The combination of human ancient DNA from surrounding areas and environmental DNA from the seabed itself promises to flesh out the family tree of Doggerland, in ways that artifacts alone never could. It turns the lost land from a geological and archaeological mystery into a biological one, asking us to consider that the people of that world are not entirely gone. They are part of us, their story written in a code we are only just learning to read, a whisper of ancient shores in our very blood. Doggerland endures not merely as a scientific subject, but as a powerful idea, a continent of the mind. It captivates us because it speaks to a deep, almost primal sense of loss and curiosity. Every culture has its myths of a golden age, a flooded world, a lost paradise. Doggerland provides a tangible, provable core for those universal stories. It confirms a haunting intuition that the world we see is not the whole story, that beneath the familiar lies the forgotten. This is not the flashy mystery of pyramids or temples, but a subtler, more profound one. The mystery of ordinary life conducted in a place that no longer exists. It democratizes the past. These were not pharaohs or emperors, but families, hunters, children, people whose lives were defined by the daily struggle and beauty of survival, making their sudden erasure by the sea feel deeply, personally tragic. The exploration of Doggerland also represents a fundamental shift in how we view human history. For centuries, archaeology was a land-based pursuit, focused on tells, burial mounds, and cave sites. Doggerland forces us to look beyond the current coastline, to think in terms of paleogeography, ancient geography. It teaches us that the map is not fixed, that the boundaries of land and sea are in a constant, slow-motion dance dictated by the climate. This reframes our understanding of human migration and settlement. Britain was not always an island. It was once a peninsula, and its earliest inhabitants walked there. This changes the story of Europe's peopling from a series of hazardous sea crossings to a gradual continental expansion. Doggerland plugs a huge gap in our collective memory, explaining the how behind the movement of people, animals, and ideas in prehistory. Furthermore, in an age of climate anxiety, Doggerland serves as the ultimate case study. It is a prehistoric example of what we now term managed retreat and climate migration. It shows the long-term consequences of rising seas, not on abstract graphs, but on the intimate scale of human communities. We see the slow-motion crisis unfold, the dwindling resources, the difficult choices, the final necessary exodus. It provides a 10,000-year-old mirror reflecting our own potential futures. The haunting question it poses is not just what happened to them, but what parts of our world will future generations study as their Doggerland? This gives the ancient story a urgent, pressing relevance, transforming it from an archaeological topic into a cautionary tale for the Anthropocene. Finally, Doggerland captivates because it is a puzzle we are still solving. Unlike the static ruins of a Roman city, Doggerland is an active crime scene, with new evidence washing up literally with each storm and each dredging project. It is a collaborative mystery, involving fishermen, oil companies, wind farm developers, computer modelers, geneticists, and archaeologists. It exists in a space between disciplines, requiring geology, oceanography, biology, and anthropology to come together to read its story. This ongoing, collaborative revelation, the sense that we are actively recovering a lost world in real time, fuels our imagination. Doggerland is not a closed chapter. It is a book whose pages we are still learning to turn, a reminder that the past is not dead, but submerged, waiting for the light of our curiosity to find it again. To truly know Doggerland, we must move beyond maps and inventories of bones and try to step into its sensory world. This is a landscape we must rebuild not just with data, but with imagination guided by science. Imagine the air first. In the early spring, it would carry a sharp, clean chill, scented with damp earth and the first green shoots pushing through the meltwater-soaked ground. Later, in the deep forests of the southern valleys, the air would be warmer, thick with the hum of insects and the rich perfume of leaf mold and flowering plants. Near the coasts, the tang of salt would mix with the rotting, iodine smell of vast seaweed-strewn tidal flats. The wind would be a constant presence on the open plains, whispering through the grasses, while in the forest it would become a distant sigh-hi in the canopy. The sounds would define day and night. The dawn chorus in the wooded areas would be a deafening symphony of bird song, thrushes, warblers, and the harsh call of crows. The grasslands would resonate with the buzz of countless insects and the chirping of ground-nesting birds. The rivers were not silent. They babbled over stones, roared in flood season, and provided a constant backdrop of moving water. At night, the sounds would shift, the hoot of owls, the howl of wolves echoing across the hills, the grunt and crash of large herbivores moving in the dark. And always the human sounds, the laughter and talk around a campfire, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of flint napping, the crackle of burning wood, the crying of a baby, the singing of a story. The light itself would be different. Without modern pollution, the stars at night would be a breathtaking, dense river of white across the black sky, mirrored in the still pools of the marshes. The aurora borealis might have danced more frequently in the northern skies, a terrifying and beautiful spectacle. By day, the quality of light changed with the terrain, bright and glaring on the open steppe, soft and dappled in the green-filtered sun of the forest, and often muted by the sea mists that would roll in from the advancing coasts, blurring the world into shades of gray and green. This sensory immersion makes the loss palpable. We are not losing coordinates on a map, but a living, breathing world of specific experiences. The feeling of cool, clean river water on the skin after a hunt, the taste of a ripe berry warmed by the sun, the gritty texture of worked flint between the fingers, the crushing fatigue and elation of a successful hunt, the profound warmth of a hearth in a hide shelter during a winter storm. This is what truly drowned. The people of Doggerland lived in a full symphony of sensation, a world of vivid immediacy that our scientific models can outline but never fully replicate. When we reduce it to data points, we miss the heart of the story. Their tragedy is the silencing of that symphony, the extinguishing of that specific light, the stilling of that particular wind. To remember Doggerland is to remember that history is not just events, but experience, and that the deepest loss is the loss of a unique way of being in the world, a world that now exists only in the echoes we can conjure from mud, bone, and the deep, remembering sea. Beneath the shifting sands and silts of the North Sea floor lies one of Doggerland's most important and fragile archives, its peat. Formed in the ancient bogs, marshes, and fenlands that dotted the landscape, this waterlogged, acidic plant matter is a time capsule of unparalleled preservation, Peat is a jealous guardian. It creates an environment without oxygen, slowing decay to a near standstill. Within its dark, fibrous matrix, the everyday minutiae of a lost world are held in suspended animation. This is not the library of kings, but the diary of an ecosystem and the people within it. Every lump of peat dredged from the seabed is a page from that diary, waiting to be read. What do these pages contain? The most obvious are the macroscopic remains. Branches of birch, roots of reeds, leaves of oak, all still recognizable after millennia. But look closer and the true wealth emerges. Pollen grains, tiny and nearly indestructible, are the key to reconstructing the ancient climate and vegetation. By identifying and counting these grains under a microscope, scientists can track the changing forests in exquisite detail. The rise of the hazel, the spread of the pine, the eventual dominance of the oak. They can see the moments when the pollen of salt-tolerant plants begins to appear, marking the creeping intrusion of the sea. They find the spores of fungi that grew on animal dung, hinting at the herds that passed by. Then there are the other, more delicate finds. Insects are exquisitely preserved. The wing cases of beetles that lived in rotting wood, the delicate legs of water bugs from a quiet pond, the chitinous bodies of midges that swarmed over the marshes. Each insect species is a precise indicator of the conditions it lived in: water temperature, salinity, the type of surrounding vegetation. A single peat sample can reconstruct the local environment down to the temperature of a summer's day 10,000 years ago. Even the DNA from these plants and creatures, known as sedimentary ancient DNA, cetDNA, can now be extracted, offering a genetic snapshot of the entire biological community from a handful of submerged mud. Most poignantly, peat preserves the traces of human activity. It can hold the nutshells from a meal, the charred seeds of gathered plants, and even the microscopic phytoliths, silica structures from plants, that can indicate whether an area was burned, possibly by human hands to manage the landscape. A piece of peat might contain a human hair, an eyelash, or a skin cell, though such finds are vanishingly rare. The very presence of certain plants, like nettles which thrive on disturbed, nitrogen-rich soil near human habitation, can signal an ancient campsite nearby. Each piece of peat is a condensed story, a fragment of a moment. When a trawler brings up a football-sized chunk, they are hauling to the surface not just mud, but a compressed piece of a spring morning, a quiet bog, a buzzing insect life, and the distant, unseen presence of the people who knew that place as home. This sunken library is finite and threatened by modern dredging. Reading its pages before they are lost forever is a race against time and tide, a desperate effort to listen to the whispers of a world that can no longer speak for itself. Without the blinding veil of modern light pollution, the people of Doggerland lived beneath a celestial masterpiece. The night sky was not a backdrop, but a central, living part of their world. A vast clock and calendar painted in stars. Their survival depended on an intimate knowledge of natural cycles, the migration of herds, the running of fish, the ripening of plants. It is inconceivable that they did not turn their eyes upward to find order in the heavens, to mark the solstices and equinoxes that governed their lives on the vast, flat plains where the horizon stretched uninterrupted. They were likely the unwritten astronomers of the north, Their observatories not stone circles, but prominent hills, distinctive trees, or notches in the distant highlands. Imagine the long winter nights on the Doggerland steppe. The cold, crisp air would make the stars glitter with a fierce intensity. The Milky Way would arch overhead in a brilliant, cloudy river. Constellations we recognize and others whose stories are lost would wheel slowly through the darkness. The moon in its phases would have been a crucial source of light for travel and hunting, its cycle a fundamental rhythm. The people would have known the path of the moon and the path of the sun, tracking their movements along the horizon throughout the year. The point where the sun rose on the shortest day would mark the depth of winter, a turning point to be celebrated with fire and hope. The summer solstice sunrise far to the northeast would signal the peak of abundance, a time for gathering and feasting. There were likely more dramatic celestial events to shape their myths and fears. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, would have been a far more common and vivid spectacle than it is today. Rippling curtains of green and red fire in the sky would have been interpreted as spirits, ancestors, or portents. A bright comet with its sweeping tail might have been seen as an omen of change or disaster. A total eclipse of the sun, turning day to an eerie twilight and making the stars appear, would have been a moment of profound terror and awe, an event so powerful it would have been woven into their oral history for generations. Perhaps the story of the day the sun died and was reborn was a memory of such an eclipse. This cosmic intimacy would have drowned with the land. When they were forced onto the shrinking island and then across the sea to wooded, mountainous coasts, their relationship with the sky would have changed. The horizons were now cluttered with trees and hills, their vast panoramic observatories gone beneath the waves. The specific sightlines from a sacred hill to a solstice sunrise were lost forever. The knowledge of the stars, calibrated to the flat geography of Doggerland, would have faded, merged with new knowledge from new landscapes. Yet some of it surely survived. The fundamental human drive to find patterns in the stars traveled with them. The myths of great hunters, bears, and swans placed in the sky by peoples across Europe may hold within them the faintest star maps first drawn by minds that gazed upward from the now drowned plains, seeing their stories reflected in the infinite dark above the whispering grasses of a lost world. As the tangible reality of Doggerland emerges from the deep, it brings with it complex and urgent questions that reach far beyond archaeology. The North Sea is a busy, contested, and exploited space. Its seabed is crisscrossed by pipelines, fiber optic cables, and wind farm foundations, and is regularly scraped by fishing trawlers. The very processes that are revealing Doggerland's secrets are also threatening to destroy them forever. This creates a profound ethical dilemma. Who is responsible for this lost world? Who owns the past when it lies in international waters, under layers of sediment, and in the path of economic progress? There are no simple answers. Only a growing awareness that a shared human heritage is at stake. The legal framework is murky. Under international law, the seabed beyond national territorial waters is known as the area and is considered the common heritage of mankind. However, practical control over the North Sea floor is divided into exclusive economic zones, EEZs belonging to the surrounding nations. The UK, Norway, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. This means Doggerland's remains are not under a single jurisdiction. but are a patchwork of national responsibilities. There is no unified Doggerland Preservation Treaty. Each country has its own laws regarding underwater cultural heritage, with varying levels of strictness. A trawler damaging a site in the Dutch sector might be subject to different rules than one in the British sector. This patchwork makes consistent protection incredibly difficult. The threat is constant and multifaceted. Bottom trawling, which drags heavy nets across the seabed, is likened to underwater plowing. It can scatter artifacts, shred peat layers, and obliterate fragile archaeological contexts in an instant. The construction of wind farms involves driving massive piles into the seabed, potentially destroying anything in their direct path and altering local currents that may have protected sites for millennia. Sand and gravel dredging for construction is perhaps the most destructive, sucking up vast volumes of seabed and sifting it for aggregate, turning irreplaceable archaeological layers into anonymous building material. The conflict is clear. The green energy and infrastructure we need for our future is being built, quite literally, on the graves of our past. This forces a difficult conversation about value and compromise. Can we justify slowing a multi-billion-euro wind farm project to investigate a potential Mesolithic campsite? Should fishermen be barred from rich grounds because they might disturb ancient peat? There are no easy choices, but the first step is knowledge. Scientists and heritage managers are now working urgently to create detailed, high-resolution maps of the most sensitive archaeological areas, hoping to steer development away from them. They advocate for mitigation, carefully dredging and surveying an area before construction, rescuing what can be saved. Some call for parts of the Dogger Bank to be designated as a marine protected area for cultural heritage, a sanctuary where trawling and extraction are banned. The story of Doggerland is no longer just about discovery. It is about stewardship. It asks us if we are wise enough to listen to the whispers from the mud before we silence them forever with the noise of our own world. And if we can recognize that our common human story, submerged though it may be, is worth a measure of our care and restraint.